Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Mark Turi, as you know. If you're new here, of course, as I like to say at the start of every episode, please give my video a like. If you have stumbled upon my channel through whatever means, through a search or whatnot, please consider subscribing. It would really, really help. I'm still at 1,200 subs and I'm inching away at getting monetized. I'm still at around 3,500 watch hours. I need 4,000 to get monetized. So that is the next goal. But of course, again, please like, please subscribe if you haven't already. And today we are going to talk about Romanian history, mainly, of course, in the 20th century, which of course was quite a century of a lot of change, a lot of technological change, but also because of the two world wars, there was a lot of territorial changes. And there were, of course, quite a lot of political changes. Want to first say hello to Professor Kakan. Good to see you. Been a few weeks, I think, since we sort of spoke or seen with each other, but very, very nice to see you. I hope you're doing well. And thank you so much for stopping by. It's really appreciate that. Thank you. And again, hope you're well. Let me know how you're doing. But thank you, Professor Kakan, who is one of our regulars. So thank you. And yeah, so um, basically, we're going to talk again about Romanian history. And then next week, I am going to finish the 8 videos and the 8 presentations that I've sort of had on my computer. A couple of times we sort of watched videos, but then I also discovered some PowerPoints on my computer. Anyway, long story short, next week we are going to talk about the history of the Romanian language. I will be giving that as a PowerPoint presentation. And then I'm thinking the week after that, we're going to switch it up and I'm going to do um, a reaction video. I haven't ever done a reaction video. I would like to do a reaction video, particularly something to do with auditing, which I think would be interesting. So I'm going to look at some things to do, especially with Dianetics and Dianetics auditing, which is again something that, in case you're new here, when I was in Scientology from 2005, of course, until 2008, some of the first things that I did was Dianetics auditing, and I became a professional Dianetics auditor. And I did a couple hundred hours of what's called co-auditing. So I think it would be quite interesting to react maybe to some of those things. There's also group auditing and so forth. And I do want to give a shout out to our Mark Postle number 4, Peter Anderson, who suggested this a couple weeks back, which I think is actually a very good thing to do. A very might be a very interesting thing for us to discuss, and doing reaction videos. And then also, I do want to eventually do a presentation on some of the stuff on my thesis, but I have to find a link um, to my university library to where the thesis will be posted. So that might take some time. And then other than that, we'll go back to sort of weekly discussions and things like this. We'll do voting like we did, in early in the year and last year and so forth. So a lot of stuff is just sort of on the end as far as all the things that I've had before. And so now we're going to sort of move on and do some new stuff, which I think will be quite exciting and quite nice. So, again, thanks everyone very much for being here. And thank you again, very much if you're watching on the replay and so forth. So, hope you stay with me in the next little while. And yeah, it should be interesting doing these new things that I'm going to try out and so on. Yes, chatters and lurkers, like, subscribe, chat, of course, share, and hit the notifications. That's another one I keep forgetting. Let's hit the notification button. The notification button will, of course, let you know when I go live. I'm usually pretty consistent when I go live. Normally, again, it's on Saturdays evening for me, which I guess would be what, about 8 o'clock UK time. So that's about 3 o'clock Eastern time. If you're in, Canada, America, it's about noon. If you're on the Pacific time zone in Canada or America, so relatively, we kind of start then. But again, who knows if there's anything like this. Um, And just to answer, I know you PM'd me, Professor, but just to answer, so book one auditing is without the e-meter, and what they call Scientology auditing, which they refer to as processing, is done with the e-meter. So it's unmetered auditing, but I think it's really interesting because a lot of the unconsensual and considered hypnosis kind of starts at book one, because you are basically hypnotizing people, and that's a whole thing that we can discuss. And I used to do that, and again, I did that for several hundred hours. um, and yes, please make sure that the notifications are set to all, because you will get be able to see when I go live. But okay, so sort of switching gears again, that's all the stuff we're going to do in the future. um, as far as doing things again, I'm sort of haven't really done any traveling or day traveling, just like probably most people. I'm sort of just trying to make my time sort of worthwhile. I'm doing some language learning and things like this. So honestly, nothing terribly exciting, to be honest with you. But I'm actually pretty okay with that. Hopefully, I'll do some stuff in the future and so on. Um, but last week we talked a little bit about political violence in the United States. I am thinking about getting to that as well, especially after some of the recent, pardon me, recent events that are, I think, were pretty tragic, regardless of how I might feel about, a specific person and their views. It's still really horrific and really tragic. I will, pardon me, I just need a cough drop. I forgot to get some water here. Excuse me. Um, I did hear about ABC letting go Jimmy Kimmel, which I think, and then of course Stephen Colbert is going to be let go. So there could be larger issues and pressures going on. Um, it is true, though, that the old-fashioned late night shows, like previously, like Johnny Carson and so forth, maybe a little bit on their way out as people prefer long form interviews, podcasts, and internet shows. But I still think that it's kind of sad in some way. Um, I'm not sure if there was a statement from Disney on why. Well, I think Jimmy Kimmel was let go due to statements from the Charlie Kirk assassination. Um, I don't know if there's been any other statement on if that was influenced or whatever. It's not my um, job to speculate. I'm also, have been following, but not all that much. But I will say, regardless, um, late night TV, late night shows. I used to watch David Letterman, The Late Show with David Letterman, quite a lot when I was growing up. I loved his top 10 lists. I used to watch Conan O'Brien. So I used to also watch The Daily Show quite a bit with Jon Stewart back in the day, especially when I was in college. So it's kind of sad because, again, the late night show of Ed Sullivan, Jack Benny, Johnny Carson, they were an institution for many, many years. Comedians got started. They'd have interesting guests that would come on and talk about all kinds of things. And who knows, again, if it's network pressure, um, if it's a change in how people consume, media or whatever. But I do think that whatever it is, and as I said, I don't want to speculate. Um, it is kind of sad because I always enjoyed that kind of stuff. And I think I'm sort of in the last generation that would have looked, to late night shows. I mean, podcasts were around, but they were just sort of starting when I was later in college and out of college. So who knows? Anyway, again, not my necessarily business to um, guess on what's going on. But regardless, I still think the late night tradition is or was a good thing. And again, who knows what is going on beyond that? But again, let's shift gears again. And today we are going to talk about something completely different from media. The topic today is on Romanian history. And as I say always, I am going to go to full screen. When I go to full screen on StreamYard, unfortunately, I can't see the chat, but I do encourage all of like everyone here. If you have any questions, any comments, any concerns, it doesn't even matter if it's on the topic, if it's off topic, doesn't matter. Just put them into the chat and I'll read them. Usually, I like to just do a slide or two after every maybe 5 or 10 minutes. I will then go back to the chat to read them. So again, doesn't matter if I can't read, go live when you're chatting or whatnot. Um, but of course, I will get to them. So again, questions, comments, concerns, additional things that you want to know, and whatnot. So please help yourself to that. Okay, so now I'm in full screen, and again, my presentation here is the history of Romania from 1918 and until 1989. That will be the bulk of our presentation today. Of course, I'll talk about a little bit about pre-World War One, and I'll talk a little bit, of course, about after 1989 because it's all quite relevant. But in here, we're going to look at the historical changes following World War One to the beginning and end of communism, and then joining Europe. So let's start. We all know from school that the armistice to end the Great War, the First World War, or World War One, which of course they didn't call it until after the Second World War, World War Two, began on the 11th of November, 1918. Now, 2 days after that date, the Romanian army, of course, came in and occupied Budapest. You guys know I live here, have been living here for about 4 years. And I think this is also kind of interesting because Budapest was also occupied previously by the Russians between 1848 and 1849, and so on. So that's quite interesting. And then also during the 1956 revolution, there was an occupation of the Soviet troops. Um, and so what had happened, of course, was at this time, and I'll get into the more details in future slides, but the Romanian army, or the Romanian country rather, had joined on the Allies. So they had joined World War One in 1916 on the side of Great Britain, France, and then Russia. Russia, of course, leaves and after the revolution in 1917, but they would, of course, be fighting against specifically Austria-Hungary and Germany, and of course the Ottoman Empire. So Romania becomes part of the Allies, and Austria-Hungary had been losing battles earlier in November of 1918, specifically to Italy. And one of the things that, again, sort of solidified their surrender was what was going on in their east, which was the Romanian army. So here we have the Romanian army's occupation of Budapest, a military occupation, which begins on the 13th of November 1918 and ends on the 3rd of August 1919. So not a year, but almost a year, of course. Now, the two photos that I have here I find are very interesting. The one to the left, and again, apologies if they're small or anything. If you can kind of zoom in, we're kind of limited with the slides, but essentially, these are Romanian troops that are stationed at a column outside of the Parliament building in Hungary, which is just up the river from where I live. I see it and go by it a lot, mostly every day. And we can see here again outside of the steps. To me, it looks like maybe a company of troops. So usually between about 100, maybe even 200 troops. And you can see they are Romanian troops at the bottom. And of course, at the top and in the background is the Parliament building. and then the troops are just outside there. Another interesting photo is on the right here. Um, you may be able to see in this photo there are 5 men. 4 men are dressed in a military uniform with gray and with helmets and with black pants. But the man who is the second to the left, okay, is wearing like a black suit. And this was the king at the time. His name was King Ferdinand. He was the king of Romania. And this is him and some generals in a small city called Békéscsaba, which is in southeastern Hungary, which is somewhat close to the modern border with Romania. Not next to it, but somewhat close to it. For example, if I take the train to, I think, Timișoara or um, uh, Arad, which are cities in western Romania, we will go by this particular small city. So again, quite interesting as far as a photo of him. I will get into the lineage, by the way, of Romanian kings and so forth. He's not the first king; he's actually the second king of modern Romania. But I'll get into kind of that again in future slides. But there he is, so I guess inspecting the lines, having a conference with some of the generals in modern day Hungary. And again, by the 3rd of August 1919, the Romanian army leaves. One of the next big issues after the First World War is sometimes called the Paris Peace Conferences or the Treaties of Versailles or the Treaty of Versailles, which happened in Paris. And there were 3 treaties that are quite significant, other than this, which is the Treaty of Trianon, but the other 2, one was called the Treaty of Saint Germain, which established what was called the Republic of German Austria, which of course would then just become Austria. And the next one is a very, very interesting treaty that still, unfortunately, to this day, has a lot of significance, particularly in Middle Eastern geopolitics, which is called the Treaty of Sèvres. And in the Treaty of Sèvres, this is what cut up the Ottoman Empire. So, Ottoman Empire consisted of many regions, including Anatolia, which is modern day Turkey. And during the Treaty of Sèvres, um, modern day Turkey was split into different zones. There would be a British, a French, and an Italian zone. Greece also received land around a city called Smyrna in Greek, or Izmir, which would eventually lead to a siege in the early 1920s when Greece and Turkey went to war, what they call the Turkish War of Independence, or the Greco-Turkish War. Also, Armenia was ceded a substantial amount of what today would be Eastern Anatolia, and there was a Kurdistan, a Kurdish state. Um, we then go into the Middle East and the Arab territories. Modern day Iraq would become, of course, a British mandate. Today's countries of Israel, Palestine, and Jordan were all considered the British mandate for Palestine. And then Syria and Lebanon were taken by the French. And these were all called mandates. Again, I don't mean to get off on a tangent, but of course, this would affect a lot of geopolitics. So when it came to Hungary, as I mentioned, Austria-Hungary, the Treaty of Saint Germain, ends the Austrian Empire, and they have a large territory that today went as far as Western Ukraine and parts of Poland, all the way down to Bosnia and so forth. And they were kind of cut up, and parts given to Yugoslavia, parts were given to other countries, and so forth. But the Treaty of Trianon specifically, which formally ended the First World War between the Allies and Austria, even though in early November of 1918, the Austro-Hungarian army had surrendered to the Italians following battles in the northeastern portion of Italy. um, several battles, in fact, um, and they had surrendered their entire army. It took again another, I guess, 2 to 3 years to ratify some of these changes. Now, the photo on the right here is of the territorial losses that the Kingdom of Hungary um, would would suffer from, would face, but it's also very significant for Romania. I will, of course, get to that in a moment. But we can see here up top, um, up top on the where there's these pie charts to the north. We have this big pie chart with a purple color. Those are ethnic Slovaks, and this whole area that sort of hooks around modern day Hungary and touches on modern day Romania would become part of Czechoslovakia. And at the time, Czechoslovakia consisted of four different regions. One is Bohemia and Moravia, which were, of course, today part of the Czech Republic. We then had Slovakia, which today is most of modern day Slovakia, and then also the eastern part of, in this photo, the area that sort of touches on the northern part of the Romanian area was called Transcarpathian Ruthenia, and that would go to Czechoslovakia, and eventually Transcarpathian Ruthenia would become part of the USSR, and today it's part of modern Ukraine. So we can see here that there was mostly Slovaks. Now, I do want to mention that in the middle here, we have this red color of Hungary, right? This is modern day Hungary. This is the shape of modern day Hungary. Most people in red, in this sort of light red, are obviously ethnic Hungarians. But you'll also notice that around modern day Hungary, and specifically, and as I mentioned before, I will get to in modern day Romania in the east, you will see a dark red color. The dark red color is those that are ethnic Hungarians that are now found themselves outside of modern day Hungary. So Slovakia, Czechoslovakia at the time absorbed a lot, as of course did Romania, and as of course did Yugoslavia. Moving to the west, we have an area called Burgenland, which becomes part of Austria. There's and then parts of Yugoslavia. So, for example, the very, very eastern part of modern day Slovenia, where there are still some villages in Slovenia with Hungarian speakers, that of course becomes part of Yugoslavia. We then have the territory um, in the southwest, where the pie chart is mostly yellow and orange. Yellow's for Croats, orange is for Serbs. And this is what's called the region of Slavonia, along with the region of Dalmatia, which goes down the coast where many of the islands are, cities like Zadar, Split, Dubrovnik. This, of course, is also part of Croatia. That was a different kingdom. That was actually part of Austria at the time. Hungary had Slavonia, which is where Zagreb is, the capital of Croatia. And of course, this territory would go to Yugoslavia. Next to that, into the southern part, right at the south, right at the bottom um, of modern day Hungary, this area is known as Vojvodina. And you can see that there are a couple of red territories because, again, there were a number of ethnic Hungarian communities, particularly in cities like Subotska or Subotica, and Novi Sad. Okay, so these areas, again, mostly ethnic Hungarians, they would go to Yugoslavia, and today they are part of Serbia. And then going to Romania, the big one in the east there, with the pie chart that's mostly blue, is of course Transylvania. Transylvania, even to this day, is a very controversial region because historically it had been a part of Hungary and the Kingdom of Hungary for centuries. And in 1920, 1921, when the Treaty of Trianon was established and ratified, this entire area, which was again historically Hungarian, was given to Romania, and there was also even a referendum. So why did that happen? It's a very complicated issue, but here are some basic ideas. So starting in 1870 and ending in 1910, every 5 years, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had a census. Now, of course, they didn't have a census in 1915 because they were still at war, and then they didn't have a census, of course, in 1920 because they didn't exist anymore. But in 1910, on the official census of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, 2.8 million residents of Transylvania were identified as ethnic Romanians. This was about 54% of the population of Transylvania in 1910. And some figures say that by about 1921, ethnic Romanians constituted about 65% of the population. I will also let you know, though, that these figures, according to some Hungarian historians and scholars, are contested and have been contested for a very long time. But one of the reasons for this population shift was most likely due to the fact that when Transylvania was a part of Austria-Hungary and part of the Kingdom of Hungary, many of the men went off to war, and of course, not all came back. And if they did, they may have come back to Transylvania, or they may have come back to Hungary, like the modern day Hungary. It really depends, right? The person, the family, etc. But of course, I just mentioned that the Romanians were heading westwards, right? They were heading west when they occupied Budapest. So during wartime, a lot of Romanians were then moving into the area as well. And so by 1921, they had constituted the majority. And that's the reason why, among other reasons, of why today Transylvania is a part of Romania rather than Hungary. And again, there is a lot of controversy still to this day. There are lots of Hungarians who strongly believe that Transylvania should be returned to Hungary. My opinion is, of course, it's been 100 years. Um, so it would be very difficult because now there are even more ethnic Romanians who live in Transylvania. So to just give it over would be very difficult. The next thing I just want to again say for future slides is you'll notice here that there are a number of that dark red color, which means that there are ethnic Hungarian communities outside in the neighboring countries. So you can see in Romania, in Transylvania, um, again in the area with the blue pie chart, there's a lot around the border, right? There's quite a few, but you can see that there's this big mass right to the center, right of our map. So there's this big area here, this big mass, and that is actually called the Székely land. And the Székely Hungarians are a subgroup within the Hungarian ethnicity. They have their own flag. They speak a dialect, and they kind of have their own sort of folk traditions and so forth. And when we get to the Second World War, this part will be connected to Hungary. But again, I will get to that in future slides. I also do want to mention before I forget that the Székely Hungarians have had moments in history where they have had autonomy and not had autonomy. So very recently, I believe last month, a delegation of the Székely Hungarians in Romania, I think they wrote to, if I'm not mistaken, or addressed at least the European Commission on trying to achieve autonomy within Romania, and the EU Commission denied their request. So there still has been a lot of political strife, now peaceful political strife, but still quite a bit in Transylvania. Okay, let's go on here. Okay, so for the next slide, as they say, to the victors go the spoils, right? So when you win a war, and especially a war like the First World War, the victors, well, they expand their territory, as I also just mentioned. Um, Even though the French, British, and Italians did not establish their zones in modern day Turkey, they still expanded their mandates to Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Palestine, and Jordan. So they were still able to have influence. They also had Egypt as well, to let you know, which they had since 1882. So they still were able to get their hands into the Middle East. But Romania, being on the side of, again, those who win, doubled their geographical size following the First World War. In this map, of course, we have two colors. We have purple, and then we have this sort of like yellow color. Let's focus first on the yellow color. So this yellow color is what Romania looked like basically from 1878. This is the year that Romania became independent following the Russo-Turkish War. Okay. And so they were able to establish this kind of backward L kind of country. In the north, you have what's called Moldavia. Its historical capital is called Iași. In the south, you have Wallachia, and its capital is the capital of modern day Romania, Bucharest. And then on the Black Sea, you have what's called Northern Dobruja, and its capital is a city called Constanța. And that region was only given to Romania in 1878. Before that, it had been part of Bulgaria. So the first thing to know is we talked about Transylvania. So you can see this huge mass of territory in the west. That is all Transylvania, of course, and that also includes another region around the city of Timișoara, which again we'll mention as a very important part of our story later. But that was called the Banat, or the Banat, and the northern part of the Banat went to Romania, and the southern part went to Yugoslavia, which today is in Serbia. So if we look at the other side, the northern and the eastern and the southern side of these territories, we see three different territories. The first is referred to as Bessarabia. So it had been a part of Russia before this. The Russian Empire took this region, but following World War I, Bessarabia would be, I guess we could say, united with Romania. And today, the most of this area is the modern Republic of Moldova. Now, I know Moldavia and Moldova sound very similar. Moldavia is a region that has been part of Romania for a very long time. It was one of the principalities that united, I think, in the 16th and 17th century. Its capital is Iași. But Moldova, the modern day Republic of Moldova, was mostly part of Bessarabia. And then the northern part of Bessarabia and the southern part of Bessarabia, particularly along the Black Sea, is part of modern day Ukraine. After this, the territory or region of southern Dobruja, excuse me, which its capital is Varna in modern day Bulgaria, went to Romania. And on a personal note, although my maternal grandfather was not born in Varna, he grew up in Varna. And I always assumed that when my grandfather immigrated to Canada in 1930, I thought he was a Bulgarian citizen. Turns out he wasn't. He was a Romanian citizen. He was, however, considered an ethnic Bulgarian. But that, again, area was of southern Dobruja would eventually be returned to Bulgaria. And I'll get into that again in future slides. And then finally, there was a region called Bukovina. And I actually studied the history of Bukovina and the Jewish history in Bukovina for my thesis. And so this region today is split again by a northern and southern region. The northern region, in which there's a city, the capital, historical capital, called Chernowitz, which today is called Chernivtsi, which is a part of Ukraine, modern day Ukraine, of course, Soviet Union, then modern day Ukraine, and in the south became part is a part of modern day Romania, and its major city is called Suceava. So this is Romania. You can see here, following the First World War, when it doubles its size. It then borders on Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the Soviet Union. So, and of course, the Black Sea as well. So, again, to the victors go the spoils. Romania did not join the war until 1916. They held out a little bit, but they were pretty lucky that they did choose the right side. Now, I will talk about these two kings in just one moment, but I want to give you a bit of a lineage or a heritage of this of Romanian kings. So, in the 1870s and into the 1880s, the very first king of Romania was a gentleman by the name of King Carol or Karl, depending. Karl being a German name, Carol being the Romanian name. Okay, the first. He had come from Germany. He was a member of a German house, which itself would cease to exist after 1918. But regardless, um, he was the king in the early 1880s, and then he died in October of 1914. Following him, let's go back a couple slides, we get King Ferdinand, who becomes king in October in 1914. He is the king again on the right here when Romania enters World War One. He, of course, becomes part of the Allies, but he dies in 1927 during the interwar period. So in 1927, King Ferdinand's grandson is next in line, and in 1927 we get King Michael the First. Now, what's very interesting about this, you might think, King Michael the First was born in 1921. In 1927, he was a 6-year-old boy. So he's established because he's the next in line, I guess, according to the laws or something like this. And you can imagine having a 6-year-old boy as king with then the Great Depression comes and the nobility, and it's a little embarrassing, and things are happening economically. And so in 1930, just 3 years later, when King Michael is 9 years old, still a 9-year-old boy, he is then replaced by his uncle. I believe his uncle, yes, his uncle, if not his father, but I'm pretty sure it was his uncle, King Carol II, who becomes the king of Romania in 1930. And King Carol II has a very interesting reputation. He is known as the playboy of Romania because he was mostly interested in dating princesses and duchesses and so forth. He was not really interested in being king, which is, I think, one of the reasons why in 1927 he didn't become king. There was probably other reasons, but at least one of them was his own disinterest in taking up the crown. He, of course, had other things on his mind, like women, and pardon me, King Carol II was a very lapsed king. He really, again, didn't want to be king, mostly a figurehead. So Romania transitions, of course, from the Great Depression. And in 1939, as we know, on September 1st of 1939, pardon me, Germany invades Poland and the Second World War begins. So about a year later, in 1940, King Carol resigns because, again, he really just doesn't want to be king. During this time, fascism has been growing. especially not just, of course, not just in Hungary and Germany and Italy and Spain after World War II, but very specifically also in Romania, a number of fascist groups like the Romanian Iron Guard and the Christian Defense League and so forth had been growing in popularity. And by 1939 and 1940, there was a prime minister who was very fascistic, who was able to sort of take control over the military, and he sided with the Axis powers. So in 1940, King Michael, who was then 19 years old, a 19-year-old young man, comes back as king, and he's reigns until 1947. And he is mostly known, King Michael's second reign, for actually being able to end fascism in Romania and then transition, leaving once there's a transition to communism. So I will get to some of those in a moment, as I normally say here. But the person who becomes very notable by 1939, 1940, 1941 is this person. His name is Ion Antonescu, and I studied a course, a political science course at my university a couple of years ago on fascism and its origin. Incredibly interesting. And I did a presentation on Ion Antonescu. So Ion Antonescu was born in 1882 and he died in 1945. Again, I'll get to those specifics in a moment. Um, One interesting fact about Ion Antonescu, and especially the psychology of discrimination and hatred, and especially um, anti-Semitism, was that when Ion Antonescu was a child, his parents divorced, and his father remarried a Jewish woman. According to Jon, this Jewish woman, so his stepmother, had placed a curse on his father, and that he always blamed this Jewish woman for breaking up his what he saw as his parents' happy marriage. He also blamed the Jews as a whole for being cursed and inferior type people. Now, we do have some statements from Ion Antonescu's father who said, no, his son was wrong. In fact, um, the marriage was not happy, and he simply fell in love with someone, another woman who happened to be Jewish, and that there was no curse. So here we kind of get an early demonization and a psychology of anti-Semitism, because, of course, Ion Antonescu's reign was characterized not only by anti-Semitism and discrimination, but he was also very much anti-Roma. Okay, the Roma population also suffered heavily, and there, during the Holocaust, to which there is what is referred to as the European Roma genocide, in which tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of Roma and Sinti people were also sent to concentration camps, along with many other groups. And this psychology is deeply rooted in Ion Antonescu. Just want to say hi to Clearwater Chad. Thank you so much, Chad, for being here. Thank you for posting um, a couple days ago. I really love seeing when you post after I make the link here. I hope you're all well. Let me know. I will, and I know I said this last week. I have to text you or message you. We have to do a showdown, a Grip Peach showdown. It's going to happen. We've got to make it happen. It's going to. And yes, please, 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 if you can, hit that like button and subscribe. So let's move on. So Ion Antonescu becomes the prime minister. He takes over something called the Iron Guard, which is very horrific. But I do want to, before I talk about the Holocaust in Romania, which is also very important. Um, as I mentioned, 1939, especially 1941, um, you know, uh, Romania enters the war on the side of the Axis. Okay. and Romanian troops go with the Germans. They fight at the Battle of Stalingrad, as well as Hungarian soldiers. So German, Hungarian, and Romanian soldiers fight the Soviets in Stalingrad, which results in 1.5 million casualties. It's the bloodiest battle in human history. And Romanians would also be defending um, Crimea and the surrounding area as the Soviets reinvaded. Also after this, around 42, 43, 44. However, Romania does get some territories. It loses two territories, but it receives another two territories during this 3-year period. So the first one I want you to notice, as I mentioned before, I'm going to go back here again, going back to this mass in the east, right? Or I guess it would be this way. Where am I? This way, all the way at the far east. That's Székely land, does get connected. You can see Hungary between these 3 years expands its territory. It takes over parts of southern Czechoslovakia, southern Slovakia, where the Hungarians were. It takes over parts of what's today Western Ukraine, where there are Hungarians, as mentioned earlier. And it does connect the Székely land with what I will call Hungary proper. And so this region is referred to as Northern Transylvania. Its capital is Cluj-Napoca, which in Hungarian we call Kolozsvár, and this becomes part of Hungary. Because Bulgaria was an Axis power, southern Dobruja then becomes a part of Bulgaria again, so basically given to Bulgaria. However, there's expansion. I mentioned that Bessarabia had gone back and forth between Russia and the Soviet Union. Well, during World War II, Bessarabia would then be taken again by Romania. Following the Second World War, though, it would be retaken by the Soviets, and then the Republic of Moldova would be established with, along with about 13 or 14 of the other states that became independent following the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. And of course, the northern part of Bessarabia and the southern part along the Black Sea would become part of Ukraine. But it does then go into another region, and as it occupies this region, is referred to as Transnistria, which today is a smaller breakaway state within within Moldova, along the eastern border with Ukraine. And this Republic of Transnistria is a breakaway state. They've declared their independence. They have their own passport. Of course, they're not really internationally recognized, except a couple of other breakaway states like Abkhazia and South Ossetia and Georgia recognize them. Um, but it's a very Russian area, especially Russian speaking area. But there's a larger territory called Transnistria, which also includes the city of Odessa. And this whole area was, of course, part of Romania. It was occupied by Romania for these 3 years. So even though Romania would lose a couple territories, it would then, of course, gain a couple of those eastern territories. But a lot of things would then change in 1944, and for the better, of course. But before I get there, I do want to mention Ion Antonescu and his part in the Holocaust. So, like the nations that were under the Axis powers, there were very few of them. Albania and uh, Bulgaria were kind of able to save their Jewish populations through negotiation. Here in Budapest, there was also most Budapest Jews kind of did stay intact for at least for a little while, whereas the countryside in Hungary was devastated. I just want to show you on this photo here on the left, the darker the blue, the more higher percentages of Jewish population. The first Jewish people to actually arrive in modern day Romania came with the Romans. So there had been, communities going back a very long time. And then during the expulsions of the Ashkenazi Jews from around the year 1000 or 800 to 1000 and onward up until maybe the 17th century, 18th century, many Jews headed east. Of course, a lot would go to Russia, which included modern day Moldova. And many people found solace in some places that we can see here in dark blue. If you look right at the bottom, you're going to see Bucharest. Also, interestingly enough, after the 1492 reconquest of Spain, we know that many Sephardic Jews left Spain and Portugal. Many of the Spanish ones would actually, some of them would end up in Bucharest. If we go to the north, especially in the carving out here, you can see the carving out in the northwest of northern Transylvania. This would be like Cluj-Napoca. If we go to the northeast, the darker blue is around Moldavia, which is in the northern sort of piece here. That would be the city of Iași, which we're going to talk about in a moment. And then you go across the border into modern day Moldova, and their city is called Chisinau, which is called Kishinev in Russian. So there was a high, very large percentage. And again, a lot of my thesis I looked about, the Zionist movement in Moldavia, Yiddish culture in Moldavia. When we talk about Bukovina in the early 20th century, there were Yiddish conferences, Yiddish literature conferences, Yiddish theater, and so forth. So there was a lot of Judaism, Zionism, and of course Yiddish culture and Yiddish, theater, books, literature in this area. But we're going to focus from this slide on a pogrom. So there have been many pogroms throughout human history. A pogrom is usually a random or premeditative act of mob violence by one group, usually against a minority group. Now, it doesn't have to be focused on Jews, or the Jews don't have to necessarily be victims. For example, in India, Hindus have unfortunately created pogroms against Muslims, and many other horrific examples as such. But Jews have been, I think, over 95% victims of pogroms, many of them throughout the Russian Empire. But in the city of Iași, which, as I mentioned, was the historical capital of Moldavia, and in today the sort of the northeastern part of Romania, in June, over a few days in June in 1941, 13,266 people, mostly Jews, if not all Jews, were murdered when Ion Antonescu and the Iron Guard went into the city, rounded up people, and murdered 13,266 individuals. It is considered the bloodiest pogrom against the Jewish people in human history, and there had been a lot of them. In 1905, there was a pogrom in Odessa that claimed the lives of 2,000 Jews, um, and horrific circumstances. But this was the bloodiest. Now, Romania's pre-war Jewish population stood at around 757,000. Ion Antonescu believed that there were more. There were upwards of 3 million Jews because, of course, we as Jews were hiding in society, and of course, it was our focus to denigrate and demonize Christianity and Christian culture. In total, victims were 380 to 400,000. That's more than half were decimated. And of course, unlike Budapest or Bulgaria or Albania, the overwhelming amount of Romanian Jews did go to concentration camps, including Auschwitz-Birkenau, a place I went 2 years ago in 2023. And of many nations, of course, have monuments there to the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of victims. And Romania is one of the many. Hungary, of course, Germany, Poland, etc. But there's definitely a Romanian presence as well. This is very tragic and very sad. Um, but we always say in Judaism, we always say never forget and never again. And now, what happened to Ion Antonescu? Well, by 1944, The Allies, um, Romania had become allied uh, with the Allies, I should say, when King Michael started to take over and really look at what was going on. I'm not really sure why he wasn't able to do take over earlier. There may be reasons. I'm not again. I've sort of forgotten. But by 1944, the Allies have landed in France. They're winning the war, so it could be political, but I don't know. But in 1944, Romania does join the Allies, and the hunt for Ion Antonescu begins. He is arrested, at least by 1945. And of course, if you've ever heard about the Nuremberg trials, as I'm sure most of you had, that was a post-war trials of top-ranking Nazis like Hermann Goering and Albert Speer and Martin Bormann, and people that worked with Hitler and were the architects of the Holocaust. Of course, they were put on trial in the city of Nuremberg. Um, Many of which either committed suicide but were sentenced to execution or imprisonment. I do want to also mention, just on a side note, at the Toronto International Film Festival earlier this month, a movie called Nuremberg, which is the third movie about Nuremberg, premiered. This one stars Russell Crowe as Hermann Goering. Also, Remy Malek is in it. You might also know from the 1960s there was the Spencer Tracy and William Shatner movie, The Trial at Nuremberg, which is a beautiful, fantastic movie. And then about 25 years ago, they also did a Nuremberg with Alec Baldwin and Brian Cox, who played Hermann Goering, in probably, as performance wise, incredible. I mean, playing such an awful, awful person, but that performance is unbelievable. So in Romania, they had their own post-war trials, and Ion Antonescu was given a trial and he was executed in 1945. And with this, we have this end of this, era of what we might call fascist Romania. And it's really interesting to note, like King Carol II and his sort of absenteeism. Could have he prevented it? He actually did have a royal dictatorship for a time, and yet it didn't prevent what had gone on. But at least King Michael, I don't know why he had waited about 4 years. Maybe it was logistics. I again have kind of forgotten. Um, but at least he sided with the Allies, and at least he was able to take back in control of his country and bring justice after the war to the Jews and to the people who participated in the Holocaust. Now we have the communist era. Okay, and the first thing is in 1946, Romania has an election, and because the Red Army had been obviously going through Romania, they had becoming under the Soviet sphere. In 1946, a group of left wing parties won this election. And then, after some organization issues and logistics issues, in 1947, the Communist Party of Romania took control, okay, um, of the country, okay, of Romania. And so in 1947, the leader of the Communist Party, who would then become the leader of Romania, was this gentleman on the right here. His name was uh, Gheorghe Gheorghiu Dej. Gheorghiu Dej. And he would change the name of the country, and it would become the People's Republic of Romania, which existed from 1947 until 1965, when Gheorghiu Dej died. Some things to note also during this time, from 47 to 65 during the People's Republic. In December of 1947, King Michael I advocated his throne. He did so under pressure from the growing left wing movements and Communist Party and so forth. He would then go into exile in Switzerland. In 1948, a year later, Romania enacted a new constitution which declared Romania to be a Marxist-Leninist state. This then state then, of course, enforced atheism, which led to religious persecution, including public religious demonstrations being forbidden. Missionary activities were outlawed. The government also nationalized all church property, and religious schools were closed. Um, Gheorghiu Dej dies of lung cancer in 1965, and this gentleman, who I know is burned into the collective conscious and collective memory of every Romanian living and will be past, present, and future, or at least past up until this point, present and future, and his name is Nicolae Ceausescu. In 1965, after a short power struggle, a relatively unknown at the time Ceausescu becomes the leader, and there will be a massive transformation in Romanian society. And especially just saying the word Ceausescu in Romania brings up a lot of um, feelings, let me put it that way, incredibly negative, as I think when we get into some future slides, we'll see why. Now, what I've done is I've condensed, and I know that there's a lot going on in this era, but I have condensed the Ceausescu regime into four different eras. Okay, and these are just my eras of my years based on the research that I got. This is totally subjective. If you have, a different um, way of looking at it, no problem. Again, comment, etc. But the first era I like to call is the early Ceausescu era, and I put it between 1965 and 1976. I will say of the four eras, this would be considered the best. Now, I know that some people, especially if they're people come to this video in the future who are Romanian or have, it's kind of an anti-communist. I understand. When I'm saying better in this, um, I'm comparing it as better than the other four, even though we can argue that the entire regime itself was very horrible. But I'm just stating for a comparison. So again, if you have a comment on that, you are Romanian, for example, or from how were affected by Ceausescu's regime in any way, you can definitely leave a respectful comment, please. No name calling or anything like this, but you can let me know what you think of these eras if you'd like. But as far as research is concerned, this would be considered the quote unquote best, as relative as that word may be. And this is from 65 to 76. So the first thing is um, the nation is renamed to the Socialist Republic of Romania. And during this time, Ceausescu expanded on certain foreign policies and diplomatic relationships that Gheorghiu Dej had established after the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953, which is that Romania became partners, international relations and foreign relations with many Western and non-Soviet backed nations. Some include West Germany, China, Albania, Israel, and Chile. Just to go through some of these, first is China and Albania. Why them? Well, China and Albania were not a part of the Warsaw Pact. China and Albania also had problems with the Soviets. And China and Albania themselves traded with each other. When Albania left the Comintern and the other, Warsaw Pacts and so forth, they became very close to China. Albania itself, it's a whole story because they had a dictator named Enver Hoxha, and they were extremely isolationist. And that again is a whole other thing. China, of course, this is the time of the Cultural Revolution. I think 65 million people were killed under Mao, obviously. But even though they were communists, they were not part of the Soviets sphere. Then we had West Germany. Of course, West Germany was the model of the West, along with England and France. West Germany was, a very democratic, liberal democracy. Not East Germany. You would think maybe East Germany because it was definitely, more communist and more under the sphere of communism. But West Germany, they had ties with. Of course, Israel being the world's only Jewish state. Um, there was definitely a lot of controversy because there was a split, especially with Israel and the Soviets. Soviets were the first country to actually recognize the state of Israel. And then Chile. Chile had a dictator named Pinochet. And in fact, Ceausescu and Pinochet met, and many people call Pinochet either a right wing dictator or even a fascist. And so that again is kind of odd and interesting, but Ceausescu and Pinochet did meet. They'd had relations together, diplomatic ones, I mean. The other thing is, of course, after Stalin dies in 53, again, another continuation from Gheorghe Dej, is that Russian culture begins to disappear. It's then emphasized by Ceausescu. This is called de-Russification. Russification means to make more Russian. So that means Russian media is used, um, Russian literature is studied in school. The Russian language becomes a second language and even a lingua franca to some of the minority communities and so forth. But by the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, a lot of this stuff just disappeared, and Romania would become, in some ways, more nationalistic. They would, in fact, emphasize Romanian culture, Romanian authors, Romanian writers, Romanian painters, and so forth. And then, at least up until a time, Western media was allowed to be consumed in Romania. Foreign newspapers and magazines, radio stations, television stations were broadcast. This would change by the 80s when Ceausescu would put signal blockers on radio and television towers to prevent Western media from coming in. But again, for a certain amount of time, you could get Western media in Romania. So, although it changed, this is why I'm calling it, of these four eras, the best. Things begin to take a bit of a turn in 1977 until 1988, which I call the middle Ceausescu era. The first is an act of God, as they say. This happens when there is a very massive earthquake that um, that happens in 1977. It's known as the Vrancia earthquake. It is a magnitude of 7.5 on the Richter scale, which is very high. In Romania, about 1,708 people are killed. 78 people, excuse me, are killed, and over 1,400 of them are in Bucharest. So Bucharest, being the capital, was devastated by this very horrific earthquake, and Ceausescu declared a national emergency. Then, because of the earthquake, the damage, and the fact that Romania had been successful throughout the 60s in manufacturing, things began to take a bit of a turn after the earthquake, and particularly by the early 80s. And one of the reasons was, as I mentioned on this channel before when we talked about Yugoslavia, Yugoslavia was one of the founders of the International Monetary Fund, which was an international organization that gave loans with interest to countries that were not part of the Soviet sphere. And in what is it called? In exchange, they had to sort of liberalize their economy and so forth, and on and on. It's one of the things that actually did bankrupt Yugoslavia, was trying to repay some of these loans. Well, in the 1980s, Romania was getting a lot of loans and so forth, and they tried to pay them back, especially not just because of the earthquake, but because of other things in general. But the earthquake again might have been you know, the genesis of this. Sort of hard to say. I don't want to be too general, but at least it was a very devastating event. So between 1980 and 1982, the Romanian government enacted what is called austerity measures. When we think of a socialist or a communist country, we think of one with like a lot of free services, a lot of social safety nets, you know, free things, free rent or whatever. Not always, but we think of a robust, incredible social safety net, not a lot of privatization. Austerity is the reverse of that. It's when the government has to kind of make cuts to social spending in order to pay back the debt. So starts happening. Um, and of course, the Romanian people are not exactly thrilled about this because, in addition, the national debt increases during this time. This leads to economic stagnation. In the 1950s, again, 40s, 50s during Gheorghe Udej, and in our early Ceausescu era up until around 77, the Romanian economy is not doing bad. It's doing pretty good. They manufactured a lot of farming equipment, and a lot of the farming equipment was bought by other communist countries and a lot of countries around the world. But what happened was, as economic stagnation hit, it was the low. There also hit lowered competitiveness. So that means that not as many people and countries and individuals and companies and so forth and countries, nations are buying things from Romania because they're getting it elsewhere because of different circumstances. And so the economy takes this huge, massive hit in the early 80s. And another thing is that around this time too, the Romanian people start to suffer when Ceausescu tells them and instructs them to do things for the country, such as eat less calories and consume less. So, like the whole nation is now suffering from these, really bad economic decisions that Ceausescu and some of his, inner circle are making. And this is again one of, and we'll get into later more, but this is a really one of the reasons why there's so much anger and hatred towards Ceausescu is because people did suffer. I mean, eating less calories to save everybody else. People starved. There were food shortages. This sort of same old story in communist countries. And again, this is really one of those points that a lot of Romanians, even to today, will talk about when they talk about their hate for Ceausescu. Now, the next one is the beginning of the end. In the photo here, I just want to introduce to you the wife of Nicolae Ceausescu, who's on the left. Her name was Elena. She will be very important in the next slide. But this is her. This is what she looked like with Ceausescu. I think this picture was probably taken again sometime in the 70s or 80s, but they were, the first couple of Romania, so they were together until the end, and I'll get into that in a moment. But 1989 is kind of what I might call the beginning of the end. Now, I do want to mention a little bit of overlap. In 1987, I do want to mention that truck drivers initiated a very large strike in the city of Brasov. And this is when the cracks start to form. Of course, when you live in a communist country, services like public services and goods and services are nationalized. So these truck drivers have a job and they have supposed to have security, supposed to have a pension and salary, and it comes from the government. And they strike because of course they want a better deal. And this is kind of again one of those things that again the foundation is starting to crack. So in 1989 is the beginning of the end of communism. One of the things that happens here is if you go to Bucharest, you can see the palace that Ceausescu, Elena, and Nicolae lived in. and there's like this large balcony, and it's above this square. It's very like Mussolinian. So there's big balcony, big square, and he would go to the balcony and he would address the people. So in March of 1989, there's protests, and the reason is, Ceausescu goes to this balcony and announces that the national debt has been repaid, and it's been paid earlier than expected, and the total was $11 billion. Now, I just mentioned eating less calories, austerity measures, strikes. The people were not happy that the nation, Ceausescu, was able to settle the debt early. They had suffered with, some horrendous conditions in their country at this point for almost a decade. So they're not exactly excited as tone deaf Nicolae Ceausescu was. Um, but again, there's even more because in November, Nicolae Ceausescu is quote unquote re-elected as the general secretary of the Communist Party of Romania. Two things about that. The election was not a free, open election like we have in democratic countries. It was a closed off secret election by a small committee who simply just re-elected Ceausescu. I do know that many people at this time living in Romania were getting sick of Ceausescu, and maybe they thought someone younger could come in, another person could come in, maybe they would help, the economy do better. But this really angered a lot of people. I mean, in the end, he is a dictator, so dictators be dictating. And this really soured a lot of people who, again, were looking for change and were looking for a new leader. This is 24 years after he, first becomes a leader. So that's almost a quarter decade of it, as quarter of a century, excuse me. And they're just looking for more. So there's a lot of animosity, and it left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. So the last is the end of communism, which comes in December 1989. Earlier in that month, in the city of Timișoara, which I've mentioned before, begins massive protests against the government in what is referred to as the Romanian Revolution. If you ever find yourself in Timișoara, there is an art gallery in Timișoara, and they have a photo a photo gallery, I guess, or a photojournalist gallery on the Romanian Revolution, taken by journalists at the time, photojournalists, um, who took pictures of the protests. Also, television, which will be very important at the end of this slide. Television was very popular this time. A lot of Ceausescu's speeches were televised, right? It wasn't just him on the square. There were cameras. There, of course, was a public station, so everybody tuned in to hear what he was going to say. And the revolution begins in Timișoara. By the middle of that month, it had spread to pretty much every major city all over, um, all over Romania. The people were fed up. They were getting tired. They wanted change. And of course, police came in, army came in, and it was again the beginning of this movement, this grassroots, ground up movement to replace their government, or at least replace their leader, then eventually to replace the entire government as a whole. Of course, you also have to know, just a month before this, the Berlin Wall falls, which is something that wasn't prepared, it wasn't planned. A lot of people showed up at Checkpoint Charlie and other places because they had passes to go into West Berlin, and then it became a whole thing. So certainly with the times, things were brewing. On the 21st of December of 1989, Ceausescu, for the last time, goes to his balcony and addresses the crowd. And for the first time in 24 years, the crowd turns on Nicolae Ceausescu. They start chanting Timișoara, 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 Timișoara. And live on television, You can see Ceausescu's face. He becomes very scared, and him and his wife Elena, who again is here on the left, they flee the palace and they flee Bucharest. They are found not long after in a village in an estate in a village called Târgoviște. They are over the next couple days up until Christmas. They're given a trial, a show trial. They of course were already guilty, but they were given a trial on television, to which Nikolai pleaded to the people of Romania, saying that he did everything he could for Romania, that he loved Romania, he loved the people, etc., etc. Again, all on TV. But that was not enough. On the 25th of December, 1989, live on television, both Elena and Nicolae Ceausescu were executed by firing squad in this estate in Târgoviște. And this photo was taken just before their execution. It's one of the last photos of the two alive. Moments later, minutes later, they would be executed. And in fact, if you do go to Târgoviște today, the estate where they were is very not far. I think it's a block or two from the train station, and you can go to this courtyard. You can actually go to the room where the actual court proceedings took place. The execution took place in a courtyard, and there are even an outline in tape on where Elena and Nikolai's bodies fell just after being executed, just after this photo was taken. And so obviously, this kind of history is very much burned into the brain of the Romanian people, even to this day, even people who were born after 1989. I've had many conversations with Romanians about them, and it's overwhelmingly negative response. Finally, 1990 as a new era for the Romanian people, the first free elections since 1946 were held on the 20th of May, 1990. A gentleman named Ion Ilinescu, who was a member of the Social Democratic Party, would become the leader of Romania, of the Free Romania. King Michael, who again was exiled in 1947 to Switzerland, he would come back. In the mid 90s, there was some talk on whether or not Romania should continue to be a republic or maybe adapt the monarchy. Of course, it's still a republic, so it didn't happen. In the 90s and 2000s, there's been a very a trying, um, difficult transition to a market economy. There were previously, just this year, elections, but there is a lot of corruption in Romanian politics. A lot of money that were supposed to go to infrastructure programs just go to line the pockets of the politicians, um, and so on. But it's also a beautiful country that I do enjoy and love going to. Romania would become more connected to Europe and, of course, the international community. It joined NATO in 2004. It joined the EU in 2007. And this year, it joined what is called the Schengen area, which is the area of free movement among many of Europe's countries. So when I used to go, and I haven't been to Romania since October of 2023, but when I used to go back and forth quite regularly to Romania, there was a border check. I think that border check has probably disappeared because of the Schengen area. But we can see here on the map, okay, on the right, this is the map of modern day Romania. You can look at some of the regions here. I just want you to know that these are regions; these are not provinces. There's a lot more, counties and provinces than just these. But if you look, we have Maramuresh, we have Lishana and Transylvania. They're considered historical Transylvania. We have the Banat, which is also considered Transylvania. As I mentioned, part of it is also in Serbia. We have Moldavia, where you can see where Yash is that we talked about before. There's in between Transylvania and Moldavia, there's Bukovina, that again is the southern part of Bukovina. And then the south, we have Oltenia, Muntenia, and Dobruja. So this is modern as of 2025. This is modern day Romania. And there's so many beautiful cities here. I've been to Timișoara. I've been to Cluj-Napoca. I've been to Brasov. I've been to Oradea. I've been to Arad. I've been to Sibiu. I've been to Bucharest. I've been to Sinaia. I've been to a lot of places, again, in the middle and the south. I still have not gone to Olteniu or Maramuresh, Moldavia, or Bukovina, but I would like to get to those places. And I highly recommend visiting Romania if you can. So thank you, everyone, very much. And hey, Peter Anderson, hey, number four, do not worry about that. I know being the summer, I know sometimes on Saturdays maybe there's competing streams. Don't worry about it. Never worry about it. I'm just hope that if you're watching on the replay or watching live, I just hope you had a good time. I hope you learned, a lot about Romanian history. Again, thank you everyone for being here. Please like my video if you haven't already. Please subscribe if you haven't done that. Next week, we're going to do the history of the Romanian language. The week after that, I will most likely do some reactions, which I think should be fun because it'll be the first time me doing a reaction. So we'll see how that works. I hope it goes well technically and logistically, but regardless, I do want to try it. And again, thanks. Thank you everyone for being here. I'm very happy when people come and people enjoy the content. I hope this video does well. I know maybe a little long, an hour and a half, usually a longer side of our videos. But again, I'm just very happy to share all this information with all of you. Again, please like, please subscribe, please comment. Do so respectfully. I'll do my best to answer comments, questions, concerns, fact checking, whatever you want. Just do that. Do so respectfully. And I will see you all next week. So in case I don't see you, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.